In the previous module, I mentioned automatic storage management, which is Oracle's file system and logical volume manager that makes it relatively easy to deploy high availability storage subsystem for your Oracle database. I hope that when I mentioned ASM, I whet your appetite, because what we're doing in this module is understanding Oracle Grid Infrastructure 12c, which is where ASM comes from, why it's important, and then how to actually install it. So by the end of this module, you'll have a high-level understanding of real application clusters, Oracle Grid Infrastructure, automatic storage management, and you'll actually know how to deploy ASM. Without any further ado, let's get started. Oracle Grid Infrastructure 12c contents. The first thing you need to remember is that Grid Infrastructure is a separate download and a separate installation from the Oracle database. You don't have to install Grid Infrastructure in order to use Oracle database. The only time where Grid is important is if you have need to do real application clusters and/or automatic storage management. To that end, when you install Grid Infrastructure on a server, you have a choice of which components you want and which ones you don't. Oracle Clusterware is the capability added to that server that makes that server available in a cluster, in a real application cluster. And I'm going to show a separate slide on that in just a moment, so there's really not much of a need to discuss it right now, but just know that Grid Infrastructure allows you to bring up a cluster node. Automatic storage management, as I've said a couple times thus far, is a volume manager that can be run in the context of a real application cluster, but it doesn't have to be. As a matter of fact, in this demo in this module, I'm going to install ASM in a standalone environment. Remember, the reason why we would consider ASM is number one, it's a set and forget it file system where you can just create schema objects and not have to worry about where they're stored and so forth. And you also have high availability capability built into the feature. All we need to know at this point about real application clusters, or RAC, is that this is Oracle's method for an active-passive or an active-active cluster for Oracle database. The idea is that you have a single service name. We know what a net service name is now, don't we? Which is tied to a single Oracle database name. And that single service name is presented to your users and to the rest of the network under a single logical name, and also an associated virtual IP address, also called VIP. Your users and applications, that's all they need to know. In their TNS names Aura, they just need to connect to that virtual service name, that virtual IP address. Now, more about automatic storage management, or ASM. When I say that ASM is a file system, what do I mean by that? Normally, when you have a disk, who cares about the operating system, whether it's Windows or Linux, it doesn't matter. You need to initialize that disk on the computer in order to make the disk visible to the operating system, and then you will go through the process of partitioning the disk, creating a volume, and the volume in turn gets formatted with a particular file system and is then accessible to the user and the applications, right? With automatic storage management, you don't feed it formatted volumes. You feed it what are called raw disks. So you need to initialize the disk and you need to partition it out, but you do not create a format on it, because ASM, when it takes those disks and absorbs them, so to speak, it will add or use its own file system on those disks. So when you devote disks into an ASM disk group, those disks will be available henceforth only through ASM and will be visible only with ASM management tools. Okay, I'm throwing a lot at you, so let's just step through this slide. When you set up an ASM instance, part of what you need to do is create one or more disk groups. A disk group is your logical storage element. It's a logical collection of disks. It could be 2 disks, it could be 10 disks, whatever you have in your array that you want to devote to ASM. Oracle will manage the disk group as a unit, and you as an administrator have relatively limited control over what's going on. So the idea is ASM is a set and forget it technology. As a matter of fact, Oracle will use Oracle Managed Files, or OMF, with ASM. So when you create schema objects and table spaces, you don't specify a full path, you don't specify a file name, you just specify the disk group, and the disk group is addressed with a plus sign. Behind the scenes, Oracle takes care of naming, it takes care of storage, and it even takes care of load balancing and speed. because as it happens with ASM, data is striped across the disks in the array. This has load balancing and I/O latency reduction as its advantages. And when you create the disk group, you can specify a redundancy option. You can do what's called normal redundancy, which is two-way mirroring, high redundancy, which is three-way mirroring, or you can specify external redundancy if you're using a third-party RAID system, a hardware RAID array, and you want to offload the RAID. Let's face it, hardware is going to give you better performance than software. ASM is a software technology. So if all that sounds good, you're probably wondering, well, what's required? Well, there's the overhead of creating the ASM instance on each box. And then administration is a little bit wonky because remember, ASM is a proprietary file system, so you're not going to be able to modify the disk groups using Windows Explorer or the Nautilus shell in Linux. Instead, you'll use SQL+. You can get at your disk groups through there, of course. ASM CMD, which is the primary way that administrators interact with their ASM disk groups, that's a command line interface, as I'm sure CMD tells you. And actually, come to think of it, Oracle does give us a basic GUI. That's the ASM CA, the Configuration Assistant. I'll show you all that in the demo in just a few minutes. Before I get into that demo, let's take the bird's eye view of what we're going to do. For ASM installation, and I'm going to do this in Windows simply because it's a little bit easier to manage disks. And frankly, from an instructional standpoint, because Windows shows you more graphically, I think it might be easier for you to learn by showing you this in Windows. Basically, the installation is the same for Windows or Linux. It's just the specific steps are a bit different in terms of how the disks are accessed. First, you want to prepare the disks that will be part of the ASM instance. They have to be in raw format. In other words, they can't have a file system on them already. Of course, you'll have nominated the instance host. I suppose that would be the first step before you prepare the disks, but at any rate, you then want to download the Oracle Grid Infrastructure media from the Oracle Technology Network and unpack the files. We then run the installer. That creates the instance, and you also are given the opportunity at that point, if you want to, create a disk group. Unfortunately, you just can create one disk group there. Then you'll have to come back, circle back afterwards with the command line tool or the configuration assistant if you want to create additional ones. And then once your ASM instance is up and running, you would, on the same box, do your database installation. And when you build your database, you can point the database at your disk group, and then going forward, if you have a database that's currently not using the disk group, you can use initialization parameters as appropriate or necessary. Again, addressing your disk group with a plus sign. That's important for you to remember. Alrighty then, let's get this party started. We're going to go out to the Oracle Technology Network website. If you do a Google or Bing search for Oracle Database 12c downloads, you'll come to this page. And what you'll want to do is first accept the license agreement. It tells you thank you. You'll see also in the top, I've logged in. I've created my Oracle Technology Network free account. Sign in, sign out. All those controls are pretty intuitive. We want to come down to the appropriate release, which as of this recording is Database 12c Release 1. And you see we have our list of supported operating systems. Windows, Oracle Linux, or just generic Linux really. Solaris, HPUX, AIX, and XLinux. I'm going to do Windows. And I'll want to go to See All. You can download the files directly, but that's just for the database. We want to go to See All. And if I scroll down just a little bit, again, I'll have to accept the license agreement. We have Oracle Database 12c Release 1 Grid Infrastructure, and then you just download the zip files for the appropriate operating system that you're using. I've done that for you here, and then I've actually extracted them to a folder. In that folder, we have a folder called Grid, and in there we have setup.exe. Now, on Linux systems, you don't have exe files. Instead, you'll have a file called runinstaller.sh, and you just invoke that from a terminal shell prompt. There's also another tool, again on Linux, this is a shell script. On Windows, it's a bat file called runcluvfy, run cluster verify. This is an important real-world tip if you're considering setting up a cluster, a real application cluster environment. This is a verification tool that does some deep checking to make sure that the system is compatible and will work in a rack environment. So keep that in mind. In our case, we're going to run the setup.exe to invoke the Oracle Universal Installer on this machine. If you've already installed Oracle Database, then you're familiar with the OUI and how it works. On the left, we have a nice detailed table of contents that shows us in advance where we are in the process and what's upcoming. On this first page, if we have My Oracle support credentials, which we would have if we have an agreement with Oracle, we could supply that, and this gives us transparent software updating. Because I downloaded this as essentially an evaluation, I have no choice but to skip the software updates. This is an important page. This is asking us what kind of installation we're doing. We have install and configure grid infrastructure for a cluster. That would be the option we want to take if we want this box to serve as a node in a rack cluster. Install and configure grid infrastructure for a standalone server. This is actually what we want because we're just going to install the ASM bits on this machine and it's not going to participate in a cluster. Third choice is to upgrade grid infrastructure or Oracle Storage Management. And I've told you this before, this little help guy, if you hover over it, it'll give you some additional info. And it says that if we're using 10G or 11G, we can upgrade those grid bits to 12C by going on this path. And then finally, we can just lay down the bits but not do any configuration. And I don't want that. I want the second option for standalone server, and then we'll click Next. I'll accept the language. And this is important. This is where we can create our first disk group. This disk group will take the name data by default. I'm going to add a 1 to that. You specify a redundancy type, high, normal, or external. I'm going to choose normal. You can choose an allocation unit size, and again, the little helps are useful. It says do not exceed 64 meg, so the allocation unit in the stripes, etc. will be 1 meg. And it says add disks, candidate disks, and there's nothing there. Well, we should take a peek, actually. Probably should have done this before kicking open the OUI, but you learn something new every day, right? We need to peek at the disk subsystem of this box. So let me do a run disk mgmt.msc to open the disk management console. And it sees that I have 4 disks that I've attached to this virtual machine. I've not initialized them. I'm going to initialize them using MBR. If these were really big disks, over 4 terabytes, actually 2 terabytes according to Microsoft, we could do the GUID partition table, but they're not. They're tiny little disks. So the old-fashioned master boot record is good enough. Let me spread this guy out, and you see we have these 4 new disks. They're showing up as online. They've been initialized, but this is not the status that we need them to be in. We actually need to create a volume. So let's right-click, New Simple Volume, and we'll step through this wizard. It's important that we do not assign a drive letter or drive path, and it's also important that we do not format this volume. And notice that it shows up as a raw partition. So I need to do this for the other 3. I'm actually going to pause the video so you don't have to watch it. Kind of boring. Okay, so we have our 4 disks here. They're showing up as raw in the disk management console. That's cool. What we need to do in order to get candidate disks visible in this window is stamp the disks. And stamping is essentially a way to hand over disks to Oracle. And Oracle will put its quote-unquote stamp on them and identify these are my disks. So let's click Stamp Disk, Add or Change Label. It did detect those 4 devices that I just brought online, so I'm going to do click 1, hold down Shift, click the last one to select all 4, and then the stamps, you have some ability to customize the prefix. I'm going to make that data 1, click Next. Not going to edit, I'll just leave them alone. Click Next, and Finish to bring those in. So now I have 4 disks available as candidate disks, and I'm only going to grab 2 in this case because later I might want to come back and create another disk group using the Configuration Assistant or the CMD tool. We'll click Next, and you'll notice that because grid infrastructure is a separate instance, you have separate administrative accounts, sys and ASM SNMP. I'm going to choose the same password for both. Best practice would be to choose separate passwords, but this is a dev box, so it's not that big of a deal. We have environment variables for Oracle Base and the Oracle Home for this instance. It's going to pick up App Grid Administrator. I'm actually going to browse to drive C, App, Oracle. I'll make that my base. After all, I do have an instance of the database already on this machine. And once you do that, the Oracle Home for Grid gets tucked under the appropriate optimal flexible architecture or OFC path. So let's click Next. Insufficient disk space on this volume. Interesting. Let me change the drive letter to F and see if there's enough space on there. Yep, there was. The prerequisite checker is giving me a ding about temp space on my system volume. It must really be low. And notice that I can't proceed. I either have to fix this and check again, or I can ignore and just steamroll through. And if you do decide to steamroll through, you get a warning. And that's fine on my development environment. We have a summary screen, and we can save this out as a response file if we want to perform a scripted install on other machines, let's say. And then we can install to actually run through and finish it out. We want to see this screen, of course, that the installation of Oracle Grid Infrastructure was successful. Great. Post-installation tasks, I want to take you into the computer to just show and verify that we are not seeing the disk group. It's invisible here. If we come back to our disk management console, we still see the raw disks, but we're not going to be able to do anything with them. If we right-click, you notice that Open and Explore are unavailable to us. So of course the salient question is, how do we get at those disk groups for management purposes? Let me bring up my administrative command prompt. Actually, I probably need to open a new session here. Assuming that Windows has set up our environment variables properly, we can open the ASM Configuration Assistant by typing ASM CA. There we go. And in a nice Java-friendly window, it tells us our instance name is +ASM, and we have our disk group called Data1. And then for cluster environments, we have the volumes and ASM cluster file system tabs, but for our database purposes, we have disk groups. And if we wanted to now create an additional disk group, we can just click Create. We're asked to provide a name. I'll say Data2. Our redundancy option, we can select our candidate disks. You can do stamping. You can do all the things we could earlier when we installed Grid Infrastructure. I'll click OK, and the installer starts to do its work. Created successfully. Well, that was pretty fast, wasn't it? So now we have 2 disk groups on the system. Now a little bit on ASM CMD. When you run ASM CMD, you may get errors pertaining to the Oracle Home and Oracle SID values. This is to be expected if you have Oracle Database already installed, because your active Oracle SID may be pointed to your Oracle Database, and your active Oracle Home may be set the same way. So you may need to make a temporary reassignment of those environment variables. So set Oracle _ SID equal to the ASM instance name, which is +ASM by default. Oracle _ Home equals to, in my case, it's F, App, Oracle, all the way out to Grid. That'll make a temporary change there. You'd use export in Linux systems. I've already done that. So if I run ASM CMD, it takes me right into the interactive prompt. Once you're in there, what can you do? Well, you can run help to get a list of commands. And you'll notice it's kind of interesting. Here I am on Windows. The commands are all modeled after Linux Unix commands. You can do everything with ASM CMD in terms of creating and managing disk groups. What's especially helpful for us as DBAs is that we can tap into those groups using traditional Linux shell commands, file management commands. So for instance, we can do an ls to see our data disk groups. You know that we have Data1 and Data2. And then we can actually cd into them and drill in. Now, of course, in my environment, it's not very interesting because I haven't put anything in those disk groups yet. To exit out of ASM CMD, we just simply type exit to come out to the command environment. So as we saw, it's not particularly interesting at this point because we haven't stored any Oracle data objects in our ASM. However, stick with me though, because as we proceed through this module, I'll show you how easy it is to set, say, db create file dest in our initialization parameters to point to a disk group and then populate our ASM instance with real live data. So more will be revealed as we go along.